Okay, so John Smeaton, local man, born on the 8th of June 1724 at Austhorpe Lodge in East Leeds. He was the first person to call himself a civil engineer. He was the one who coined that phrase. There were engineers before him, but they were military engineers. So he was the first person to coin the phrase civil engineer. He was born with an inquisitive mind, and he was always building things and taking things apart and looking to see how things worked. He spent most of his 30-year working career at Austhorpe in East Leeds, but he did live and work in London for a period of time, and he always maintained offices there. Okay, so here's a picture of a painting of John Smeaton, obviously done in later years, and this was actually his favourite painting of himself. He felt that this one was the most lifelike one that he had. After his death, it was presented to the Royal Society. So he was born at Austhorpe Lodge to William Smeaton and Mary Stones, and he was the eldest of 3 children. John's brother William was baptised at Whitkirk on the 25th of January 1727, but sadly died 5 years later in October 1732. John's sister Hannah was born in April of 1732. She also sadly died on the 8th of June 1753, aged only 21. This happened to be John's 29th birthday, and she's buried in London. John's father, William, was a lawyer with his own very successful practice in Leeds, so he was born into a quite substantial and wealthy family. At the top of the screen, we've got the entry for John Smeaton's baptism at St Mary's Church at Whitkirk, and it reads, John, son of William Smeaton, was baptised the 24th of June, 1724. And below that, we've just got a drawing from Samuel Smiles.
No.
Sorry?
It's Thomas Sutcliffe.
Oh, sorry, from Thomas Sutcliffe. Showing St Mary's Church at Whitkirk and Holysharp Lane leading up to it. This is a 1767 map showing the area where Austhorpe Lodge was. This is maps that prior to Ordnance Survey maps. But the nice thing about these maps are that they don't only show you the landscape and the buildings that were on the landscape, but they also show you the names of people who were living in the important houses. So you can see here that we've got at Austhorpe Hall, we've got the name of Mr. J. Smeaton. At Seacroft Hall, we've got Nelthorpe Esquire. And at Killingbeck Hall, we've got J. Brooke. And down at Temple Newsham, we've got Lord Irwin. So quite useful, these maps. This is a photograph of Austhorpe Lodge, where he was born and lived most of his life. It was demolished. It was built in 1698 by his grandfather, who was also called John, and it was demolished in the mid-1930s to make way for a housing estate. There's rather a sad story associated with this photograph, because it was taken by a gentleman called Roger Batley, who was one of the crew members of the Hood, and sadly he was lost when the Hood went down in World War II. And this is another photograph of the Austhorpe Lodge. Here we've got an 1891 Ordnance Survey map showing Austhorpe Lodge. So there's Austhorpe Lodge and his Smeaton's Tower, where he worked, his workshop. There's the stables, and there's the cart house, which is where they presumably kept the trap or whatever it is that whatever kind of conveyance they used. This map comes from the sales details for when the estate was up for sale in 1891. And this is a photo of the rear of Austhorpe Lodge, which was formerly the front of the lodge. Right, we've now got another drawing by Thomas Sutcliffe. Thomas Sutcliffe visited at Austhorpe in 1861. And so this drawing shows the lodge, and it shows Smeaton's Tower, which was his workshop that he built when he'd returned from working in London. It also shows in the front a pond, an ornamental pond. Now, one day when Smeaton was in his early teens, he went to Garforth and he watched some men getting water, subtracting water from a mine by using a pump that was driven by a steam engine. And so he came back to Austhorpe and he built himself a model of a steam engine and attached it to a pump. And he drained this pond and left the poor fish flapping about in the mud at the bottom of the pond. And well, his father wasn't best pleased, but he was delighted because it showed that his equipment worked. On another occasion, and this is the kind of thing he was up to all the time, on another occasion when he was only about 6 or 7, he constructed a windmill-like device to be a weather vane, and he was found on top of one of the barns on the estate trying to fix it to the roof. So this is John Smeaton's workplace. This is his tower workshop, which he built when he returned from London. And this photograph dates from about the 1930s. Somebody was actually living in this structure. I don't think they were living there when this photograph was taken, but they certainly were living in the 1920s. So the tower was 5 stories high, and the ground floor had his forge. So that's where he did his ironworking and his tin smithing. The first floor had his lathe, which he built himself when he was only 15 years old, and he used to create models and also to make presents for people, from wood or ivory. The second floor was the storage area for the models he made. When he was embarking on any project, he always made a working model of it, and he used the second floor to store the models, but also to demonstrate how things would work to his potential clients. The third floor was his where he did his plans. So he called it his drawing room. We would call it the drawing office today, but he called it his drawing room. And the fourth floor was his observations room. He was very interested in astronomy. In fact, that was really his main hobby. It probably was his only hobby because he was such a workaholic. Probably didn't have very much time to do anything else. But he was really very interested in astronomy. And he had telescopes that he'd made himself in that room. And he used to observe the sky from the roof of the tower. John Smeaton was educated at Leeds Grammar School, and he was a very able pupil, and he certainly excelled in mathematics and geometry. He didn't get on very well with his fellow pupils. He was a bit of a loner, and he certainly wasn't interested in the kind of things that the other boys that he was at school with were interested in him. And in fact, his fellow pupils referred to him as foolish Smeaton. So this is a drawing of the lathe that he constructed when he was only 15. And like I said, he used it to make the models of the project he was working on, and also to make gifts for his family and friends. So as I've said, John's father, William, was a highly successful lawyer in Leeds, and he wanted John to follow him in this profession, which John didn't particularly want to do, but that's what his father wanted him to do. And so in 1742, William sent John off to London, where he attended the courts in Westminster. And he was most unhappy. He didn't want to be in the law. He wanted to be able to spend his time making things, making instruments, inventing things. So after a couple of years, he had after discussions with his father agreed that he could give up the legal profession and concentrate on his mechanical pursuits. So he came back to Austhorpe and did just that. In 1747, he made himself a telescope to observe the sky at night and became proficient at grinding and polishing lenses. In 1748, following a disastrous love affair, he decided to go back to London, and he set himself up as a scientific instrument maker. The story behind this love affair is that He was going into Leeds to learn French, to take French lessons. And he met this lady who was very far below him in the social status. And his parents were very distressed by this entanglement. Because he'd met this lady, he fell in love, he asked her to marry him. And his parents were very much against this liaison. But he actually stood his ground and said that he was going to marry the lady. And his parents said, well, at one point they threatened to cut him off. But they did eventually come round to the idea of him getting married to this young lady. But they said they would only agree to it if they got married in London and if they lived in London. Well, that's when the girl's father got involved, because he came along and said, I'm not having my daughter going to live in London. So eventually, sadly, the engagement had to be broken off. So John went down to London and he set up work there. His great friend, Henry Hindley, who was his friend and mentor from York, actually gave him a telescope that he'd made for him to sell, to give him some funds to get his business off the ground. And he set up his first workshop in Great Turnstile off Holborn. And by 1751, he was employing 3 craftsmen. The volume of work forced him to find larger premises, and so he moved to Fernville in Court. And in 752, he started experiments with wind and water. One of his first major successes as an instrument maker was to make this mariner's compass. And he worked on this in conjunction with his friend Gowan Knight. After sea trials on the HMS Fortune, this compass was actually taken on as standard Royal Navy issue. And about the same time, he also developed and protected a vacuum pump. This is an example of John Smeaton's actual writing. This is in the front cover of a book that he gave to her friend. And this book is held in the Leeds Library, not the Central Library, the subscription library. And you can go and see it. It's not on normal display, but you can make an appointment to go and see it. And we've been to see it. It says, to Mr. Bateman from the author, Austhorpe, 9th of November, 1771. And when we went to see it, I think Bob thought all his birthdays had come at once. He was so delighted to actually see Smeaton's writing. 1756 was really the year of destiny for John Smeaton. Between 1753 and 1756, he'd expanded his business from instrument making to becoming involved in major civil engineering works. On the 7th of June 1756, John married Anne Jenkinson, who was a distant cousin, at St George's Church in Hanover Square in London. And on 1756, it's also the year he began work on the Eddystone Lighthouse. John had been over to the Low Countries looking at windmill designs, and he sailed back to England. He should have landed at Scarborough, but the seas were so bad that the boat couldn't get in. And so the boat had sailed up the coast to Scotland, and he disembarked in Scotland. And that's where he was when the request came through for him to design and build the Eddystone Lighthouse. So Smeaton took on this work, and he went down to Plymouth, and he met Josiah Jessup, who was a foreman shipwright in the naval dockyard, and he'd been responsible for the maintenance of the Rudyard's Tower lighthouse, which was the one that had just been destroyed by fire previously. Previously, another one built by Winstanley had been destroyed by a tempest. So there had been 2 lighthouses on the Eddystone Rock, and they had both been destroyed. I mean, the Eddystone Rock, it's 14 miles outside of the Plymouth Harbour, so it's a good way out into the sea, and a pretty scary place, really, a hairy place to be trying to build a lighthouse. John Smeaton drew up a design to build a stone lighthouse, which most people said couldn't be built on the rock. But John Smeaton was going to find a way around that, as he always did. And Josiah became responsible for overseeing the building work. The two men became great friends, actually, and when Josiah died in 1761, Smeaton took his son William Jessup on as a pupil, and he also acted as William's guardian. About 1768, William Jessup moved on to form his own career as an engineer. So John took on a second apprentice, Henry Eastbourne, who was actually his nephew. John went on to become Henry's assistant and remained at Austhorpe until 1788, and he became a respected civil engineer in his own right. So John Smeaton was a really good teacher and mentor, and the young men who were under his care were able to come into their own. So here we've got a couple of images of the lighthouse that he built. As I said, 14 miles off the Plymouth Hoe, so in quite unpleasant seas. People said he couldn't build it in stone, but he actually devised a way of interlocking the stones so that they fitted together like a jigsaw. So this had made it a very firm and strong base. And not only that, but he also developed a special kind of hydraulic lime or cement that when it was wet, it became harder. It didn't disintegrate, it became harder. So with these two things, he was able to build a stone lighthouse. The design was based on the shape of an oak tree. So a very solid base, coming out at the bottom. And this actually was the design that all future lighthouses were built on for several hundred years, really. So it was first lit on the 16th of October, 1759. Originally, the light was a chandelier with 24 tallow candles, but eventually that was replaced by oil lamps and reflectors. So here we see a model of the interlocking stones that he devised, and you can see that it creates a very solid base. Now, the first 7 courses of the lighthouse were made in this fashion. So it was a very, very solid base. And what they did in the first year of the building was they actually dug into the rock and put the first couple of 2 or 3 courses actually down into the rock. And as I say, he was using this new type of cement as well. In later years, John Smeaton, who's also a Leeds man, further refined the cement that he designed, and it became Portland cement, which is what we know today. As I've said, it was far out to sea. The seas could be very tempestuous around it. In fact, they couldn't even get onto the rock to work during the winters. They could only usually work from around about April time, was when they were able to get out to the lighthouse to actually work on it. And even then, they could only go over at low tide. And it was very, very dangerous to be working on the lighthouse. In fact, Lord Ellesmere, who wrote essays on the engineers, said that working on the lighthouse was as dangerous as being a soldier in battle. Here we've got an image of the Eddystone medal, which John Smeaton had struck for his workmen to wear. And this was to prevent them being picked up by French privateers, because what had happened in previous times, and we don't know whether it happened actually at any time to John Smeaton's workmen, but certainly during the time of the building of the Winstanley Lighthouse, French privateers had boarded the rock and taken the workmen prisoners and taken them back to France, presumably for ransom. But the French king at the time, Louis XV, was very annoyed about this, because he realised that the building of the lighthouse was benefiting everybody. It would benefit soldiers of all nations. And he told the privateers immediately to take the men back to England. He said, I'm at war with England, but I'm not with mankind. So they had to take them back. So Smeaton got this medal struck, and his workmen wore it, and in the hope that if the privateers did come, they would leave them alone. But as I say, we don't know whether that actually happened during his time or not. And here you can see the replacement lighthouse that was built in 1878. Yeah,
1882.
No, it's 1878 it was built.
Oh, okay.
By the mid 1870s, the late 1870s, the lighthouse was still in very good order. There was nothing wrong with the lighthouse that Smeaton had built, but the rock on which it was built was disintegrating. So it had to be replaced, and it was replaced by a lighthouse built by James Douglas, basically to the same design as Smeaton's. In 1882, Smeaton's lighthouse was removed from the Eddystone Rock and rebuilt on Plymouth Hill as a tourist attraction. When this happened, the people of Austhorpe wanted to be able to bring the lighthouse back to Leeds, but sadly they couldn't raise the funds to do that, because apparently it was going to cost about £1,800 just to get the lighthouse from the rock onto Plymouth Hill. So they couldn't afford it, the people from Leeds. But the people from Plymouth raised the funds, and they did bring it back onto the Hill as a tourist attraction. So the vicar of St Mary's at Whitkirk at the time said, the more solid part is to remain on the rock, which it did. I mean, you've seen the picture of the stump of it as it did remain, because they simply couldn't demolish that at all. It was so strong. The more solid part is to remain on the rock, and when at last undermined by the billows, it shall fall into its deep watery grave. Lovers of antiquity may come to Whitkirk Church to learn its form, and find it has been outlived by the very marble that foretold its duration. But in fact, that hasn't happened yet. It hasn't sunk into the billows. It is still there. The stump remains still on the rock. And here you can see there's a picture of the Douglas Lighthouse taken in 2005, and still the remains of John Smeaton's lighthouse out on the rock. So we're going to look at some of the insides of the lighthouse now. As I say, it is a tourist attraction. You can go around it. So we're looking at the kitchen, which is pretty basic, and the staircase. This is the oil room. As I've said, although originally lit by candles, it did eventually become lit by oil lamps. So this is where they stored the oil. And you see you've got an inscription that's around the walls of the oil room, which is actually taken from Psalm 127, and the whole inscription reads, "Except the Lord builds the house, they labour in vain who build it." We're looking now at the sleeping quarters for the lighthouse keepers. Looks more like a coffin to me than a bed. I wouldn't want to be using that, I'm afraid. And this is the lantern room and the stairs going up to the lantern room. Obviously not much attention paid to health and safety in those days. This is the view from the lantern room. The candelabra that you can see there now is actually a replacement. It's a replica. It's not the original John Smeaton candelabra. Here we've got an old penny. It's a 1964 one. And you can see that's actually an image of the Eddystone Lighthouse is on this penny. And that's just proof, really, of how important this building was. And it wasn't just on the pennies in 1964. We've seen several examples of old pennies with the lighthouse on it. So just to summarise what went on with the building of the lighthouse, work began on the rock on the 5th of August 1756. Smeaton left the rock, leaving the lighthouse keepers behind, on the 9th of October 1759. with Trinity House, which is the body responsible for looking after lighthouses, arranging that the light would be first lit on the 16th of October 1759, and the light was last lit on the 3rd of February 1882. The height above the mean sea level was 800 feet, was 80 feet, sorry, 80 feet, and the construction costs were £16,000. The lighthouse remained on the lock for over 120 years. And as I say, there was nothing wrong with the lighthouse when it had to be demolished. It was the rock that was disintegrating. On the 15th of March 1753, John Smeaton had been elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society. And on the 22nd of November 1759, he won the Copley Medal. Not for the work that he'd done on the lighthouse, which, judging by the date, she might have thought it was, but it was for a paper he read to the Society entitled An Experimental Inquiry Concerning the Natural Powers of Water and Wind to Turn Mills and Other Machines Depending upon a circular motion. And this is a copy of the Copley Medal that he was awarded. He was only the 26th person to get this medal. This is Smeaton's coefficient. It is the equation he used as part of his calculations when experimenting with the power of wind to help him design the most efficient windmill sails. And this is part of the report that actually gained him the Copley Medal. Over 140 years later, the Wright brothers used this formula and they amended it slightly, and they used it to help them design the wings for the first aeroplane. Those of you that are quite, what's the word? You might have noticed that
mathematical.
No. You might have noticed that this equation has got a NASA icon in the corner of it, and that is because NASA actually has acknowledged that this coefficient that Smeaton designed was an important contribution to the history of aviation. So we're just going to look at his family life. In 1757, sadly, John and Anne lost their first child, Hannah. But they had another daughter, Anne, and she was born in 13th of May 1759, and she was baptised at St Andrew's Church, Holborn. They were living in London at the time, and John's mother was also living with them, and she sadly died later that same year. And this is when John decided to move back to Austhorpe. He hadn't ever really been comfortable living and working in London. He felt he was a bit of a misfit. He didn't really think that he fitted into London society. So he decided to move back to Austhorpe, and he came back to Austhorpe at around about 1760. In 1761, his daughter Mary was born at Austhorpe Lodge. And then on the 10th of January 1765, he had another daughter, Hannah, who was baptised at St Mary's Church of Whitkirk. And she sadly died at a young age. I think she was only about 11. As I've said, John's main hobby was astronomy. He was very, very interested in astronomy. And he had his own observatory on the 4th floor of the Smeaton's Tower, and he built his own telescopes. And he read several papers to the Royal Society. So in June 1769, he read one about an observation of the solar eclipse that he'd done at Austhorpe. He was a member of the Lunar Society, and in 1771 co-founded the Society of Civil Engineers. And following the death of Smeaton in 1792, this society was revived and renamed as the Smeatonian Society of Civil Engineers. He was a workaholic, and he was an extremely busy man, and he had calls on his time from all over, not just from Britain, but actually from other parts of the world. The Tsarina of Russia had been in touch and wanted him to go work over in Russia, and she apparently promised him you know, name your own price, riches beyond measure, but he wouldn't go to Russia to work. But he was getting on, and his health was deteriorating slightly. So in 1767, he issued this trade card to people who were coming to him with commissions, explaining that he would only undertake work that he thought would be important and that he would like to work on. And in order to reinforce this, he increased his prices. So you can actually see at the bottom where it says his lowest fee for a consultation at home is 1 guinea, but if sent for, it's 2 guineas. And if employed the whole morning or a day in London, it's 5 guineas. Now, these were something like double the prices that he had been charging up to that time. But it didn't have the effect that he wanted. He still got the same amount of requests for his time. But he did work more on a consultation basis from then on, rather than being hands-on, as he had been when he did the lighthouse. He physically did the work when he was building the lighthouse. But he became more of a consultant, and he always did his own drawings, and his daughters actually finished them off for him by hand colouring them. Although he is mostly remembered for the Eddystone Lighthouse, he did a lot of other works. So we are just going to look at some of the other works that he's done as well. So he worked a lot on canals. He worked on the air and colder navigation. He worked on improvements to this canal. And although he did the investigations and report, the work was actually carried out by his assistant, William Jessup. And this is the blue plaque that's near the Royal Armouries on the Air and Colder Navigation Canal. And this was put there by Leeds Civic Trust in October 2005, and it was funded by the Smeatonian Society. He also worked on the Forth and Clyde Canal at Glasgow. He designed the route for this canal. He worked on the Your Navigation and Ripon Canal, which opened in 1773, which connected Ripon with York and the Humber Estuary. He worked on the Calder and Hebble Navigation in 1759. This runs from Wakefield to Sowerby Bridge. He worked on the River Lee Navigation, which is in London. In 1765, the trustees asked him to assess the navigation and make recommendations for its improvement. He made a survey of the river and produced a report in 1766. He also worked on several bridges. So he built the Perth Bridge in Scotland between 1766 and 1770. He built the Coldstream Bridge between 1763 and 1767. He built the Cardington Bridge in 1778. He built the Queensberry Bridge over the River Avon in Wiltshire in 1775. He built the Banff Bridge in Scotland from 1772 to 1779, which spans the River Devon. And he built the Stonehouse Creek Bridge in Plymouth, which he designed in 1767, but it wasn't actually built until 1773. Now, this bridge, the Hexham Bridge, failed. It was only a couple of years after it was built. There was a very unusual, once-in-a-lifetime tempest, storm, and the foundations of it failed and the bridge collapsed. And Smeaton was absolutely devastated. There was no loss of life, there were no injuries, but he was absolutely distraught at the fact that this had happened. And in fact, he said, all our honours are now in the dust. So he just felt that because he'd had this one failure, everything else that he'd done before counted for nothing. He never built another bridge after this. The bridge was replaced, and the man who built it actually built it to Smeaton's original design. But as I say, Smeaton was so upset he would never build another bridge. And in fact, this was a very sad time for him altogether, really, because only a couple of years after the bridge failed in 1784, his wife died, and Smeaton sank into a kind of depression, really, and he wouldn't take on any new projects. He wouldn't accept any more new work, and he really became a recluse at Austhorpe for a couple of years. But he managed to get over that, and he sort of got back into the swing of things by refurbishing some of his equipment his old equipment that he built previously. He also worked on viaducts and windmills and other projects. So this is the Great North Road Viaduct over the River Trent between Newark-on-Trent and South Muscombe. This was a huge piece of infrastructure, really. It had 125 arches, and it was regarded as the major piece of civil engineering, really for the 19 and until the 20th century, from the 1800s and 1900s until the beginning of the 20th century. He built windmills. This is the chimney windmill, which he built in Newcastle in 1782. It was in use as a windmill until 1892, so for over 100 years, when it became a golf club house until 1795. The wind shaft, sorry, 1975, sorry, 1975. And the wind shaft and the cap were removed in 1951, and it was restored in 1976, and it's now a private house. And it does have a plaque on it to say that it was the windmill built by John Smeaton. He built this dam on the River Coquette in 1776. This was a very fast flowing river, and something was needed to suppress the flow. So he engineered the dam, and that redirected the water to the bank where there was an iron tin works, which he was also involved in the building of. This later became a watermill. And here are some of the other things that he was involved in and built. Smeaton Lighthouse was designed by him in 1770, and it was built by William Taylor, an engineering contractor, from 1771 to 1776. He advised on fen drainage systems such as Adley Fleet Level, Deeping Den, Hatfield Chase drainage, Holderness drainage, Lochar Moss, and Potterick Car drainage. He submitted reports and drawings for many harbours, including Cromarty, Port Patrick, Aberdeen, Peterhead, Eyemouth, and consultations for Dover, Yarmouth, Scarborough, Sunderland, Whitehaven, Workington, and Lynn. Not all of these designs were completed, or some of them were partially completed. It was mainly the cost of them that decided whether or not they were fully completed or partially completed or not at all. Excuse me. And the final harbour that he worked on was Ramsgate Harbour, which was finally completed in 1792, just after his death. He also got involved in several local works. So this is the Austhorpe windmill, which Smeaton knew as Sykesfield Mill. He didn't build it, but it did belong to him. It was on his land. And in 1781, he converted this mill from a corn mill to a mill to produce linseed oil. And this was for his son-in-law, John Brooks. So it was changed from a 4-sail mill to a 5-sail mill. And this is an example of the kind of mill. In 1770, he built an experimental steam engine at Austhorpe, conducting a series of 130 tests. He developed the Newcomen engine, which had been designed by John Newcombe, to the limits of its capacity before James Watt came along and placed a condenser outside of the cylinder in 1775, which greatly increased the capacity of the engine. And between 1767 and 1783, Smeaton designed 13 steam engines. And this is a drawing of his experimental engine, which he built at Austhorpe in 1770. So John Smeaton made detailed observations of 15 working engines in 1769. And after this, he was able to define the performance of a steam engine in terms of power and efficiency. So he named power as great product and he named efficiency as effect. Without changing things, James Watt came along in 1782 and 1783, and he renamed these definitions as horsepower and duty, respectively. And these are the terms that are still used today. In 1770, he built this self-perpetuating water engine or hydraulic ram for Lord Irwin of Temple Newsham. The ram was designed to pump water from Jacob's Well, which was on the estate, to the house, to a reservoir under the kitchens of the house. And it was in use for about 100 years until Leeds Corporation took over the supply of water to the estate. Smeaton used his knowledge of steam engines to design the machine, realising that water pressure could be used to drive an engine equally as well as steam pressure could. Bob will now explain the workings of this piece of equipment.
Right, now the first thing I have to say is that I'm not an engineer, but I do know an engineer, and he is a member of our society, and he did explain how he thought it worked. Now, Jacob's Well was about 400 feet away from this engine, but it was 54 feet higher as well. The diameter of the pipe at Jacob's Well was 4 inches. When it came down to the engine part, it reduced to 1.5 inches, thereby increasing the pressure. Now, before we go any further, Jacob's Well was in use actually by Temple Newsham House, even in the 17th century, and they used to take the water in some sort of canister by horse and cart over to the house. But this time, Smeaton was going to pump it there directly. The inlet pipe was down on the left-hand side here. But when you see it get down to this point, there's 2 pipes. This top pipe goes into here, through this valve and into this piston, and it actually works the engine once it gets going. The second pipe comes down here, through the stopcock, along here, and then back up to this piston here, through this valve and into the house. Now, what would happen when the house required water is that a servant would be sent down. The stopcock would probably already be on, but if he wanted, would turn it on. It would come to this flywheel here, it would start turning it round. And as soon as the speed of the wheel was going fast enough, the engine would be going. This wheel actually got these pistons and valves going. It's important to say that all these were very highly synchronized by Smeaton in the first place. Once this wheel got turning, the water pressure itself took over and kept the wheel turning all the time. And so it came out of this bottom pipe here, the outlet pipe, and up to the house. Now, Jacob's Well was situated between 300 and 400 metres from the house. It's here where I put this arrow, and there's the house there. This bottom picture, I couldn't get my camera down into that hole because I would love to see what's inside it. But this is Jacob's Well itself. Originally, before Smeaton got involved, it was an open spring, but they actually covered it over to stop the cattle sort of walking into it and doing whatever else that they did. The water comes out the bottom from here, and then it comes down this slope right to the bottom, to this field area here, and that's where the engine room was. Now, the engine room was it was underground, and it had an arched ceiling, and it was the base of it was 15 feet underground. Now, as I said earlier, the water travelled 400 feet from Jacob's Well, which was a vertical drop actually of 54 feet, so quite substantial. From the engine room, it came directly up to the house, underground, of course, through this culvert here at one end, and it came out at this culvert here. Now, in between the two, in between the entrance and the exit to the culvert, there were inspection hatches. Now, the lower south terrace in Smeaton days wasn't even there, but this has been left there on purpose just to show what it actually was. From this culvert here, it came under the back lawn of Temple Newsham and into the kitchen, and it went into a reservoir under the kitchen. And this is a picture from the top of a reservoir, it's deep down there somewhere. When the servants in the kitchen wanted water, they used hand pumps to actually get at it. Between Jacob's Well and the house, the machine raised the water at 26 feet.
Thank you, Bob. Right. Smeaton also designed all the gates for the entrances to Temple Newsham. There were 5 entrances to Temple Newsham, and he designed all the gates for them. But these are the only ones that are remaining. These are the Sphinx gates. Although they weren't hung here originally, they were actually originally on the North Lodge, and they were built by, they were made at Whitkirk Forge. It didn't have anything to do with the fancy posts. It was only the gates that he designed. Now, there was a in Leeds pottery had a flint mill in Leeds, and we think, but we don't know, we cannot confirm that Smeaton may have been responsible for replacing the windmill sails in 1774, because what happened was that the original windmill sails were destroyed by a heavy storm one Sunday. Local folklore says that people were saying that it was divine retribution that they were destroyed because of the mill being worked on a Sunday. So certainly the sails were replaced, and in Smeaton's book of design, it shows that he designed a 5-sail flint mill shortly after these ones were destroyed. So it's very likely that he actually was the person who replaced them. But I can't say that for, I can't 100% guarantee that it was him. What I can guarantee is that he did some work on the water storage system at the General Infirmary in 1776. Someone else had installed the system for water storage, but there were problems with it, and the management at the infirmary were in dispute with the person who had installed the system. So they asked John Smeaton to come along and have a look at it and review it and see whether it could be repaired or whether it needed to be completely replaced. And John Smeaton looked at it and produced a report which suggested that it could be repaired. And he also suggested that they should line the water tanks with lead. But of course, they obviously didn't know what lead did in those days. He was also involved in Seacroft Ironworks on Foundry Lane from 1779 to 1780. The Anglo-French War at that time had caused increased demands for iron and for flour. In 1779, the ironworks were re-equipped with 2 30-foot diameter water wheels and a steam engine to power bellows for furnaces and drive two pumping engines when required. A pumping engine returned water to the 3-man reservoirs that were on site for reuse. When John Smeaton went to survey the site, we did see that there was a mill there already. And in fact, there had been a mill on that site from Henry VIII's times. And there was also man-made ponds to provide the water. So he had something to work with before he actually made the renovations there. And this is the photograph of the mill wheel that was removed from the site in 1938. This isn't the original wheel that Smeaton designed. It's a replica of it. It was a replacement of it, but it's not actually Smeaton's wheel, but it was built to his design. He also was involved in advising on the repair and maintenance of the church clock and the bells at St Mary's Church, Whitkirk. He was very much associated with the church at Whitkirk. And I'll just read you the entry from the parish church records about what he did, the work he did on the clock. This is dated from 1786, and it says, on March the 1st, the vestry agreed that the church clock should be repaired and altered according to Mr. Smeaton's direction, and that Mr. Smeaton should appoint the workmen and the expense to be defrayed out of the money collected by the church assessment. The clock was repaired, altered, and entirely new modelled, and removed from the belfry to the chamber above by George Goodall of Aberford Clockmaker, and by and with the approbation of John Smeaton, Esquire. The clock was set up in June 1786, and then there's a further entry which says, in 1786 to 1787, paid to John Goodall for clock mending, £3 and 3 shillings, and paid to Mr. H. Atkinson for a clock weight, 4 shillings and 2 pence. So we'll just have a further look at his family life. His daughter Anne married John Brooke of Killingbeck Hall at St Mary's Church, Whitkirk, on the 10th of August 78, and the couple continued to live at Austhorpe Lodge after they married, and John Brooke was responsible for the linseed oil mill that was on the land, so that was his business. Mary Smeaton married Jeremiah Dixon at St Mary's Church, Whitkirk, on the 6th of December 1781. And Jeremiah later became Lord Mayor of Leeds in 1784. In 1791, John Smeaton officially retired from his profession. 1 year later, whilst walking in his garden, he suffered a stroke, but he very quickly recovered from this. Sadly, however, within 6 weeks, he suffered a second major stroke, and he died on the 28th of October 1792, and he's buried in St Mary's Church at Whitkirk. In his will, he acknowledged his illegitimate son, John Reynolds, and he made provision for John by buying him a commission in the Navy. So this is a picture of the nave of St Mary's Church, Whitkirk, where John Smeaton is buried. It's a beautiful church, and this is the altar. And he is buried immediately behind the altar. Now, you cannot see from this picture, but there is an inscription on this paving stone to say that it's where John Smeaton is buried. And in fact, there's also a memorial stone for him in Westminster Abbey, which was unveiled in 1994, and that simply says John Smeaton, civil engineer, 1724 to 1792. And there's also a memorial on the wall at Whitkirk Parish Church, which was put there by his daughters, by his 2 remaining daughters. And this is what it says. Sacred to the memory of John Smeaton, FRS, a man whom God had endowed with the most extraordinary abilities, which he indefatigably exerted for the benefit of mankind in works of science and philosophical research, more especially as an engineer and a mechanic. His principal work, the Eddystone Lighthouse, erected on a rock in the open sea, where one had been washed away by the violence of a storm and the other having been consumed by fire, secure in its own stability and the wise precautions of its safety, seems not unlikely to convey to distant ages, as it does to every nation on the globe, the name of its constructor. He was born at Austhorpe, June the 8th, 1724, and departed this life October the 28th, 1792. Also sacred to the memory of Anne, the wife of the said John Smeaton, who died January the 17th, 1784. Their 2 surviving daughters, of love and respect for the kindest and tenderest of parents, pay this respect to their memory. So what did other people think about him? What did his contemporaries think about him? What did people who came after him think about him? Well, James Watt affectionately referred to him as Father Smeaton, and he wrote, "In justice to him, we should observe that he lived before Rennie, and before there was 1/10 of the artists there are now. His example made engineers of us all." And Robert Stevenson, builder of the Bell Rock Lighthouse, said to Samuel Smiles, Smeaton was the greatest philosopher in our profession this country has yet produced. He was indeed a great man, possessing a truly Baconian mind, for he was an incessant experimenter. His mind was as clear as crystal, and his demonstrations will be found to be mathematically conclusive. When young men ask me what they should read, I say, go to Smeaton's philosophical papers, master them thoroughly, and nothing will be of greater service to you. Indeed, he was a very great man. And that's a bust of John Smeaton, which has in recent years been put into the lighthouse on Plymouth Hill. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie and Bob. That was absolutely fantastic. Really was. I had no idea about the breadth of his work. Absolutely outstanding. We have had a few questions. So this is a webinar format. So if you want to ask questions, you need to put them in the chat because you won't be able to speak. And it's impossible for me to find. We've got over 100 people joining us this evening, so it won't be possible for me to let people in to talk. But if you want to say anything in the chat, then please do so. Jackie and Bob, the one thing I was just going to ask you, and I suppose your slide at the end there gives a clue, but I mean, this must have taken an awful lot of research to put together, and I'm interested, you know, as to how you actually approach that. You obviously got some information from the West Yorkshire Archive Service, but you must have, and some of the photographs are absolutely fantastic. So how did you approach it?
I've been studying Smeaton now for about 20 years because he's a man that really intrigued me. And not only that, he was a man that was not very greatly spoken about or ever seen on television. Everybody's heard of James Watt and Brunel and Stevenson and all these people. But John Smeaton was sort of pushed into the background. And I started to think, why? Because this man had such a brilliant mind, and really an awful lot of the work he did was actually used by engineers that came after him. But yet he did not seem to get the recognition 20 years ago, which I thought he actually deserved. But I thought, well, at least I'll recognize him and I'll study him. And I was intrigued. The main information I got in the beginning was from Lives of the Engineers by Samuel Smiles. And then a man called Skempton wrote a book, a bit more detailed, a bit more modern, about the life of Smeaton. And basically, apart from that two books, there's very, very little else. So I went down to West Yorkshire Archive Service, and they had bits and pieces of information about the local area in particular. People like Mr. James Lomax, who used to be a curator at Temple Museum, helped me. He was the one that actually told me about the gates on the actual Sphinx gates. He said the actual metal gates were actually designed by Smeaton, and there were 5 entrances to Temple Museum House at that time, and every one of the entrances had gates on like that. But they're the only gates that survive, and they were taken from the North Lodge. I used the Wicker Parish records. Mr. and Mrs. John Chapman, who used to live at Austhorpe Hall, which was near to Austhorpe Lodge, they were helpful to me. And the engineer, Mr. Ken Brace, he's the one that explained about the engine. The thing I didn't mention on that, by the way, was that there are 2 pistons, but the second piston has got a slightly less diameter than the first piston, and apparently this has an effect of forcing the water even higher, and that kind of thing is used for fountains, that sort of principle. And also Mr. David Thorpe, who is working now at Temple Museum, he actually took me around the site where the water engine was, along with other people. So over the last, I've sort of picked information up from bits and pieces. I've got bits of sort of magazine cuttings and things like that,
Mm.
which I've gained over about the past 20 years. So that's how it's been done, really.
There's a question about his relationship with Matthew Murray. Did he know Matthew Murray? Did he work at all with Murray?
Oh no, a different century.
Yeah,
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 so
that's
no,
right.
they didn't know each other at all.
No. And what about Brunel?
Oh, definitely not. No,
No.
because remember, we're talking about the 18th century
That's
now.
right.
Yeah.
He's a good 100 years before these people, isn't
Oh,
he?
yeah, yes, he is.
They use the knowledge that he created, really, didn't they?
That's absolutely right. Yes.
Yeah.
You could almost say it was one of the main sources, in a way, of the Industrial Revolution. It was a real inspiration to the early engineers.
Yeah. Do we know anything more about his illegitimate son?
No, I'm afraid we don't.
No, we don't. No.
I do have a copy of his will, and he is mentioned. I was surprised to read it because I'd never heard of this before. But that's where I found out he did have an illegitimate son. Yes,
But we don't know when he was born, do we? We don't know how old he was when John Smeaton died.
no.
Meryl's just put in the chat that your book about Smeaton's going to be reprinted soon. Is that right?
Oh, that's right. It was about 2007, Lee's birthday. I wrote a book of Smeaton, a small sort of, well, it's about 40 pages actually. Briefly, like this talk, it sort of goes through his life bit by bit, and it was sold out. I got to about 400 copies of it, and that sold out. And somebody suggested to me, because they're having an event at Whitkirk Parish Church over the weekend of his birthday this year, we're going to be part of it. We're going to give this talk again, and somebody suggested to us, why don't you rewrite the book? I said, well, it's been way out of print now for years. So I said, well, we think it'd be a good idea to do it. So I looked at it and said, okay, then, because I've learned an awful lot since I wrote that book. I wrote that booklet in 2007. So what I'm going to do is rewrite parts of it and update it, and sort of modernize it, and it will be available round about his birthday in June.
Oh, fantastic! That's really good. I'm just looking on here to see if there's anything else. Any other questions? Anyone else got any questions?
It says here, where exactly was Austhorpe Hall?
Yes.
Well, the thing is, Austhorpe Hall and Austhorpe Lodge are two separate buildings. Now, Austhorpe Hall was built, well, the Moore family,
1694.
yeah, the Moore family that used to be the residents of Austhorpe Hall, they've been there since the 14th century. But Smeaton just lived up the road
Right.
from Austhorpe Lodge, two entire separate buildings. But Austhorpe Hall was one of the early pioneers, if you like, of coal mining in Yorkshire. They were one of the first people, if not the first people, to actually put a steam engine in to pump water out of their mine. It was only a small mine, but Smeaton would be certain to have known about that. But it's still there, is Austhorpe Hall. It's actually survived. Never got, in fact, it's still occupied. There are people in it, it's a residential home. And it's up Austhorpe Lane. So if you come into Cross Gates and turn right down Austhorpe Lane and over the bridge and up the hill, you'll see it on your left-hand side.
Austhorpe Lodge was more or less back from Selby Road, isn't it? Modern Selby Road.
Yes. The original entrance to Austhorpe Lodge was off Austhorpe Lane, but later, to maybe a century or so later, an awful lot was changed there, and the entrance was changed. And the entrance became Selby Road.
Okay, that's useful to know. Now, Kathy's just sent us a really interesting link to a book that was published in 1874, Smeaton and Lighthouses. I just clicked on that, and it does actually give you the full manuscript of the book. So, yeah, it might be worth having a look at that. And then, Joanna Mawson, Murray was born in 1765, but possibly only arrived in Leeds around the time Smeaton died. So, but perhaps attracted here partly by his reputation and projects. And of course, in City Square, we have a statue to James Watt. And I think there was some discussion at the time about whether Smeaton should have had the recognition, and of course he didn't. And it's sad in a way that you know you have to go down to you know, to Plymouth to see a bust of Smeaton, but we don't actually have anything in Leeds, do we?
Yes, we do. We do have the Smeaton Viaduct. That was named the Smeaton Viaduct by Leeds City Council.
But do we have an actual, you know, physical sort of, you know,
Yeah,
statue?
there's an actual plaque on the side of Leeds Viaduct. No, also got a school named after him, John Smeaton Academy.
Bust or statues.
Oh no, there's no bust or statues of him.
No, that was what I was wondering. And that seems to be a bit of an omission, really, doesn't it? Given
Yes, it does. Yes,
given his importance to the world of engineering, but you know, the fact that it was from this city.
yes.
So do we? If we don't have any more questions, I'm going to draw things to a close because we're getting close to 8:30.
Right.
That was that. I mean, is there anything else you want to say before we wrap up, Bob or Jackie? Because that has been fantastic.
Can I just mention that as Bob has just said, on the weekend of the 8th, 7th, 8th and 9th of June, which is his actual birthday, St Mary's Church, Whitkirk, are having a big celebration of his life. And can I just give you a plug for that? It's beginning on the evening of the 7th. Bob and I are redoing this talk on behalf of the Phil and Lit Society, and we're doing it at the community centre that's by the church. And then on the Saturday, so that's the 8th, which is his actual birthday, there will be an exhibition in the community centre, and it's a provisional programme at the moment, but they're hoping that they will get somebody from the Smeatonian Society to give a talk in the afternoon, and possibly in the morning, possibly about 11 o'clock, but the time isn't confirmed. There will be a walk around Temple Newsam led by an estate officer. So that will look at not the Ram, because obviously that's not there, but where the Ram was, and Jacob's Well. And at 5 o'clock on the Saturday evening, there will be a service of commemoration in the church. And then on Sunday, the church will be open, and there'll be possibly an exhibition in the church as well. So there's quite a lot of things going on to celebrate his 300th anniversary.
There are. I've just I put it in again into the chat. There's a web link there to Smeaton 300, which is you know, again a sort of a place where you can go to find out more about various things that are happening in the city during the course of the next 12 months. But that sounds like a really good 3 days of celebrations, really. So that's really appreciate letting us know about that. Okay, well, I'm glad. I'm delighted that we were the first to hear about to receive this presentation as well. So in a way, we've got the first look at it.